So today is your Friday, and so we are going to have a shortened lesson. I think that's kind of working for me on this Friday, or this cycle of Fridays, because that allows us to finish up with all of our team talk by next Thursday, which will then be a test day. So shortened lesson today, so we kind of want to just jump right into it. Our end in mind is still, I will identify cause and effect relationships in the story. We want to keep that front and center always, because that's what the gut of our lesson should always kind of reference back to. So I want to make sure that you kind of have that in your thought process, okay? So we want to look at question 1. Question 1 says, give evidence from the text to support the conclusion that the Wallace store is not a good place for the kids to be. Now, if I had said I want some background knowledge, you could have thought back to last week when Papa told the kids that he did not want them down there. But I specifically said that it needed to come from today's reading. So that's going to take us to page 84, okay? So I want you to go there. On page 84, so I would say, let me get my read state going, that the text that supports that the Wallace store is not a good place is on page 84, where it says, just look at all the little ends come to dance, and the laughter of the men filled the room. So they're using very racist type language, and they're thinking that it's funny. That's one. Then I could have said a little further down that it's not a good place for the kids because they're inviting the kids to go into the back room where the music is playing, and one of the Wallaces are placing round brown bottles on a small table as they crowded in. Now, what's the assumption that is inside of those small brown bottles? It's a type of alcohol, and they're offering it to kids. And so as a mom, I do not want my kids hanging out at a place that's just passing out alcohol for them to drink. And that's why it's not a good place for them to be. Number 4 says, Big Ma thinks that Mr. Granger is what? And to me, that one might have been just a little bit harder because that took us to the very last page that we read, where Mr. Granger's car was there when the kids pulled up with Mr. Morrison. Trying to find it. Might help if I knew what page we stopped on. Looks like we stopped on page 89. So let's see if I can go back there. Had a big giant sticky note right on it. If we look at that, where Big Ma says he don't need it. So if you don't need something and you want it and you keep aggravating people about it, the word that seems to fit here is greedy. And that's how we know that that's how Big Ma feels about him. All right, so we want to go back to page 89. And as I'm reading, I want you to keep in mind that end in mind for the lesson. Identifying cause and effect relationships in our story, because that's the big important piece. Well, it seems to me he's just being greedy. You ain't going to sell it to him, are you? Big Ma did not answer me. Instead, she pushed open the gate and walked down the drive and across the road into the forest. And I ran after her. We walked in silence down the narrow cow path which wound through the old forest to the pond. And as we neared the pond, the forest gaped open into a wide brown glade, man-made by the felling of many trees, some of them still on the ground. They had been cut during the summer after Mr. Anderson came from Strawberry with an offer to buy the trees. The offer was backed with a threat, and Big Ma was afraid. So Anderson's lumbermen came and chopping and sawing and destroying the fine old trees. Well, Papa was away on the railroad then, but Mama, she sent Stacy for him. He returned and stopped the cutting, but not before many of the trees had already fallen. Big Ma surveyed the clearing without a word. Then, stepping around the rotting trees, she made her way to the pond and sat down on one of them. I sat close beside her and waited for her to speak. And after a while, she shook her head and said, "I'm sure glad your grandpa never had to see none of this. He dearly loved these here old trees. Him and me, we used to come down here early mornings or just before the sun was about to set and just sit and talk. He used to call this place his thinking spot, and he called that old pond there Caroline after me." She smiled vaguely, but not at me. "You know, I wasn't hardly 18 when Paul Edward married me and brung me here. He was older than me by about 8 years, and he was smart. Oh, my Lord, that was one smart man. He had himself a mind like a steel trap. Anything he seen done, he could do it. He had done learned carpentry back up there near Macon, Georgia, where he was born. Born into slavery he was, 2 years before freedom come, and him and his mama stayed on at that plantation after the fighting was finished. But then when he got to be 14 and his mama died, he left that place and worked his way across here up to Vicksburg. That's where he met you, ain't it, Big Ma?" I asked, already knowing the answer. And Big Ma nodded, smiling. "It sure was. He was carpentering up there, and my papa took me in with him to Vicksburg while we was tenant farming about 30 miles from there to see about getting a store-bought rocker for my mama. And there was old Paul Edward, working in that furniture shop just as big. Had himself a good job, but that old job wasn't what he wanted. He wanted himself some land. Kept on talking about land, and then this place came up for sale. And he bought himself 200 acres from that Yankee, didn't he?" Big Ma chuckled. "That man went right on over to see Mr. Hollenbeck and said, 'Mr. Hollenbeck, I understand you got land to sell, and I'd be interested in buying me 200 acres if your price is right.' Old Mr. Hollenbeck questioned him good where he was going to get the money to pay him. Paul Edwards just said, 'Don't seem to me it's your worry about how I'm going to get the money, just as long as you get paid your price.' Didn't nothing scare that man," she beamed proudly. And Mr. Hollenbeck went on and let him have it. Of course now, he was just about as eager to sell this land as Paul Edward was to buy. He'd had it for going on nigh 20 years, bought it during Reconstruction from the Grangers, 'cause they didn't have no money to pay their taxes. Not only didn't have tax money, they didn't have no money at all. That war left them plumb broke. Their old Confederate money wasn't worth nothing, and about Northern and Southern soldiers had done ransacked their place. Them Grangers didn't have nothing but they land left, and they had to sell 2,000 acres of it to get money to pay them taxes and rebuild the rest of it. And that Yankee bought the whole 2,000. Then he turned around and tried to sell it back to them, huh, Big Ma?" Now, just for comprehension's sake, why did the Grangers have to sell that 2,000 acres? Yeah, they had to sell it because after the war, they mostly probably had Confederate money because they were big Confederate supporters, and that money wasn't worth anything, and so they were land rich and money poor. And even though you're land rich, you've got to come up with tax money. And so when the yearly taxes come due, they didn't have cash. And the only capital that they had was that property. And so they were stuck with selling it to get the money that they needed. Now, I had planned on reading a little bit further. So let me take a look here. Yeah, if I don't, it's going to leave us a whole lot of reading on Monday. So, 91. Now, then he turned around and tried to sell it back to him, huh, Big Ma? Sure did. But not till 87, when your grandpa bought himself that 200 acres. As I hears it, that Yankee offered to sell all 2,000 acres back to Harlan Granger's daddy for less than the land was worth. But that old Fillmore Granger was just about as tight with a penny as anybody ever lived, and he wouldn't buy it back. So Mr. Hollenbeck just let other folks know he was selling it. And it didn't take long for he sold all of it, 'cause it was some mighty fine land. Besides, your grandpa, a bunch of other small farmers bought up 800 acres, and Mr. Jameson bought the rest. But that wasn't our Mr. Jameson, I supplied knowingly. That was his daddy. Charles Jameson was his name. Charles Jameson was his name, Big Ma said. A fine old gentleman, too. Well, he was a good neighbor, and he always treated us fair, just like his son. The Jamesons was what folks called Old South from up in Vicksburg. And as I understand it, before the war, they had as much money as anybody, and even after the war, they managed better than some other folks, 'cause they had made themselves some northern money. Anyway, old Mr. Jameson got into his mind that he wanted to farm, and he moved his family from Vicksburg down in here. Mr. Wade Jameson was but about 8 years old then, but he didn't like to farm, I said. Oh, he liked it all right, just never was much hand at it though. And after he went up north to law school and all, he just felt he ought to practice his law. Is that how come he sold Grandpa them other 200 acres? Sure is. And it was mighty good of him to do it too. My Paul Edwards had been eyeing that 200 acres ever since 1910, when he done paid off the bank for them first 200. But old Mr. Jameson didn't want to sell. About that same time, Harlan Granger come head of the Granger plantation. You know, him and Wade Jameson, about the same years, children, and he wanted to buy back every inch of land that used to belong to the Grangers. That man crazy about anything that was before the war, and he wanted his land to be every bit like it was then. I already had more than 4,000 acres, but he just itching to have back them other 200 his granddaddy sold. Got back 800 of them too from them other farmers that bought from Mr. Hollenbeck. But Grandpa and old Mr. Jameson wasn't interested in selling, period, was they, Big Ma. They didn't care how much money Mr. Granger offered them, I declared with an emphatic nod. That's the truth of it, all right, agreed Big Ma. But when Mr. Jameson died in 1918 and Wade came head of the family, he sold them 200 acres to Paul Edward and the rest of his land to Harlan Granger and moved his family in Strawberry. He could have just as easy sold the full 1,000 acres to the Grangers and gotten more money, but he didn't. Until this day, Harlan Granger still holds it against him because he didn't. Now, I think I'm going to stop right there. So let me kind of mark this in my lesson plan. I like this spot to stop for today, and you should like it too. So we will pick back up in a week. You guys enjoy the weekend, and I'll see you in a couple of days. Love yous. Have fun.